Shalom, everyone. Chodesh Tov. And we'll continue today with a diminished Minyan, which is the last paragraph of chapter 2. And we're going to discuss the idea of what happens when people leave, and also hopefully get to the next chapter of the place of prayer. So, Rabbi Melamed talks about what happens when people leave in the middle of a Minyan. Rabbi Hertzfeld mentioned a while ago that one of the tricks, that's what he called it, of the rabbis was to have the mourner's Kaddish and the Kaddish Darabanan at the very beginning of the service, so after Korbanot and before beginning Psukkah Zimra, and also at the very, very end. So basically, to cover both bases, if people come late to shul, they can still remain there to say Kaddish at the end. But if people come early but have to leave because of work, because of whatever scheduling is happening, and they can say it at the beginning, and then that way fulfill their obligation to their parents for the 11 months and leave sometime during. Unfortunately, a lot of times we have exactly 10 men, and so that's where this chapter is addressing what happens when people leave after they have already been there for the beginning of the minyan. So when the recital of Kaddish in the minyan has begun, and a few men leave in the middle, if most of the minyan remains, which means at least 6, including the Chazan, the Kaddish may be completed. The same rule applies to all prayers that require a minyan. If they started to pray with 10 people and most of the minyan remained, they conclude the prayer that they started, but do not begin a new prayer. So we would conclude the Shmoneh Esrei, we would conclude the repetition of Shmoneh Esrei, but we wouldn't, for example, start the Kaddish Derabanan after the rabbi's teaching at the very, very end. And the Sephardi and Sephard communities have Enke Lohenu, which is a rabbinical teaching, so there's automatically Kaddish Derabanan, but Ashkenazim do not, and therefore that's why Rabbi Hertzfeld and others teach something at the very end, so that we may say the Kaddish Darabanan afterwards. It is prohibited to walk out and disband the minyan in the middle of matters of sanctity. However, in situations in which it is necessary, one is permitted to leave before the start of the next part of the prayers. And I'll just give a personal example from my brother. On October 7th, of course, it was Simchas Torah in Israel, and people were called in the middle of davening. And so there was nobody to be able to read the Torah, and my brother stepped in and read the Torah. And of course, they still had a minyan because a lot of the people were older and therefore they weren't called. But in terms of actually having the reading of the Torah, there was the person who was supposed to do it had to leave because he was called to reserve duty, and that's something that happens all the time. And of course, just in regular minyans, in normal times, not during war. If somebody has to leave because they have to go to work, or they have to take the bus or the train or the subway or whatever it is, then of course it's legit. Just unfortunate that they are part of those 10. So if a minyan began Chazarat Hashatz and part of the minyan left, but most remained, those remaining may say Kedusha and conclude the repetition of the Amidah. However, they do not say Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing, because it is a mitzvah by itself. And this is mostly for Israel, but Rabbi Hertzfeld Minyan, of course, does do the blessing of the Kohanim when there's a Kohen present, even not on Yantiv. So it's important to remember this. Concerning Kaddish Kabal, which is what we call the full Kaddish, after the prayer service, the poskim are divided. The Sephardic custom is not to recite it, since it is considered to be the start of a new prayer. according to the Ashkenazi custom, it is considered to be the end of the prayer service because in it we ask that our prayers be accepted. That's actually the only difference between the Kaddish Shalem, the full Kaddish, and the mourner's Kaddish is that verse, Kabbalah Sloton, which means literally, may our prayer be accepted by Hashem. And so that's why we say it after the Shmoneh Esrei in all three prayers, morning, afternoon, and evening, because we always say, may these prayers be accepted. Therefore, in Shachrit and Mincha, if there are 10 men at the start of Chazarat HaShatz, the repetition, they may recite Kaddish Kabbalah, the full Kaddish. In Shachrit, they also recite the half Kaddish before Ashrei, which is something that is a side note. In Mariv, which is the evening prayer, if there's a minyan at the beginning of the sound Shmoneh Esrei and 6 men remain, they recite the full Kaddish, and that is the law that we follow. So let's talk a little bit about what is the mitzvah to pray in a synagogue. Of course, this is not mentioned in the Torah, and so the word mitzvah may not exactly be the right term, but by fulfilling this idea, there's many benefits. The first benefit is that by praying in a synagogue with an organized congregation, or organized minyan, you're basically allowing people who are mourning to say the Kaddish. There's also the idea of prayer in one place as opposed to all over the place, because it's less permanent, it's less important, it's less important in the eyes of the people that attend, because why should I go to this house and not to this house? So that's why it's considered a mitzvah, but not a biblical mitzvah. It's just the idea of establishing such a place, and it's all based on the temple, which he doesn't mention. But the idea is that when the temple was built, there was no such thing as a synagogue. There was one central place for prayer, and so that's what we're trying to imitate. That's what we're trying to continue, and the synagogue is called a mikdash me'at, meaning a mini temple. So that's really what this whole chapter is going to be about the regular place, about where this place is, what kind of synagogue you join, etc., etc. So when a person prays in a synagogue with a congregation, their prayer is heard, and this is according to the Gemara in Brachot. Even someone who missed praying in a minyan has a mitzvah to pray in the synagogue, since it is a permanent and special place of holiness in where prayer is more accepted. So today, because of security, we don't have the option to just walk into a synagogue because it's locked. But in the old days, when synagogues were an open place, it is preferable to pray in the synagogue as opposed to in your house. And many communities in Israel, especially in the settlements where there's fences around and everything is very secure, and the synagogue is left open 24/7, and anybody who wants to just walk in can. However, when the minyan is held in a different place, it is preferable to pray with the minyan rather than individually in a synagogue. So let's say that there's a Shiva house, and that's the most common example. It is better to go to the Shiva house instead of praying by yourself in the synagogue, because there are some communities that are so small that's where the prayer is. And I'll just mention that in 6 years ago, I was asked to be in 2 different Shiva houses during the day, so I ended up leading the prayer 5 times a day, and I called myself a Muslim rabbi because I prayed 5 times a day. But that's the idea, that they weren't willing to come to the synagogue, they weren't willing to sit Shiva together. It was 2 different houses, and so sometimes that's what you have to do. If there is a small minyan in the synagogue and a larger minyan elsewhere, Although there is merit to praying in the company of many, the value of praying in a synagogue is greater. So, for example, if you're invited to a wedding, but it's exactly the same time as your usual minyan, then you should, of course, go to the synagogue, not rely on the fact that they're going to have a minyan afterwards at the wedding. Every community has an obligation to fulfill the mitzvah of building a synagogue which will be their mini sanctuary, Mikdash Me'at, which is what I said before, and where people can pray in a minyan. As it is written in Ezekiel, I have been for them in a small sanctuary, and Rabbi Yitzchak interpreted in the Talmud, Megillah 29a, these are synagogues and study halls. And last but not least, it is preferable, if you can, to pray where you study. So Rish Lakish says, whoever has a synagogue in the city and does not pray there is called a bad neighbor. Moreover, he brings exile upon himself and his descendants, those who arrive early to synagogue to recite Shacharit and are late to leave after praying Mariv, merit long life, all these different blessings. And it is a mitzvah to run to synagogue, just as it is a mitzvah to run to perform any mitzvah. And that is basically on a verse in Hosea. We will race in order to know Hashem. Likewise, when one leaves the synagogue, he should walk slowly because that is showing more respect to the synagogue.